everyone. You have to say though, that's a little bit of an untruth when it comes to you, because I've reorganized dates just to show up
That's true.
in Dara and Noah multiple times. So Kevin knows I'll say, I'm going to get back to you. Let me get back to these people to find another date. So that's how important the Father's Core and what Kevin and Gary started is to me. So I'm always happy to show up whenever he comes calling, and I know that I have to show up strong, or he'll whisper in my ear later or send me an email. And luckily, I haven't had that happen. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. So forgive me, I'm dealing with multiple monitors here, making sure that you're seeing the right one. Here we go. Awesome. So we've titled this A Father's Role in Child Development with an Understanding of Temperament. And I did throw some brain development stuff in there. So this one isn't on brain development, but I did throw a few slides in there and some slides on research. Okay, so we will have 2 breakout spaces. It's going to be filled with information. So I'm encouraging everybody that's on to grab something to write with, grab something to write on. And you will get a copy of the slide deck, so you don't have to worry about screenshots or taking pictures of the slides. You will get every single slide in an email. Instead of that, I want to encourage you to write down, when you hear information, thoughts and memories that come up for you based on what's on the screen, what you're hearing, and to think about, why is that memory or that thought coming up for you? Because that's what we can act on. Oftentimes writing down what's on the screen is just regurgitating information, and nothing big happens from that. But your thoughts, your feelings, your reactions, your responses, if you're in tune to them and you write them down and can link what that means for you, that's real information we can act on as it pertains to fathers, mothers, and even their child or children. So as Kevin said, I'm Sean Bryant. I'm going to be your facilitator on this learning journey. For those who were here last month when I did a presentation, or for those who, if this is your first time meeting me, I have kind of 2 dual roles. I'm the director of Yes to ECE, the consultancy that brings me here, where I consult, coach, and train adults who care, educate, and work with young children and their families across the country. And my kind of other big role is I'm the director of professional development and adult learning at the Child Lab at Yale University. And in short, all that means is we created this fancy tool, and we train mental health consultants who go into schools, and we train coaches who go in and see, how do you affect climate? How do those adults affect climate? So that's how I spend most of my days. This is a little over 30 years that I've been doing this work. Those are my god kids you see there, who are all in Oakland, California. That's Shola over my shoulder. She just had a birthday last month. She is now 10. That's Buhai, who's below me. He just turned 12 last week. And that's Madison. She will be 6 December 27th. So I have no idea why Jonathan and Tiffany decided to have 3 children all at the end of the year near Christmas and Thanksgiving. It just makes their godfather frustrated, because I have to think, I'm going to get this for their birthday and then this for Christmas. But I love them. They keep me young. And they're starting to beg more as they get older, which is really, really different. What you see on the screen is just a little bit about me, what guides my thinking, my thought process in terms of 30 plus years in this work of early childhood and family studies. For those who, if you're first time meeting me, I'm the contributing author of Trauma Responsive Family Engagement in Early Childhood, and the author of Trauma Informed Practices, the 2nd edition. So in full disclosure, I'm not trying to sell the book, because I received 0 cents from any of these books. We decided that for each book, we donate the proceeds to a different agency across the country. So for Trauma Responsive Family Engagement, every dollar, 4 times a year when they cut the check, those checks go to Parent Voices Oakland, and all we see is how much money they received. And let me think about, I can remember. Middle age, sometimes you forget things when you're in your 50s. Trauma-informed practices, the proceeds for that goes to Young Warriors in New Orleans, the second edition. And the first edition, the proceeds go to a Butterfly program in Brooklyn, New York. All early childhood programs that are servicing young children and their families. I'm excited about it. So I won't dig too deep into this because we already did it. I was going to ask everyone to kind of list what you already listed in the chat. So we'll jump right into the agenda for today. So one of our big hopes and goals is that this understanding of what's the father's role and how their role in development and how it shows up a little bit different than moms based on what we've learned over the years. We won't take a deep dive. We're going to, I like to say, take a roller skating glide across child development in our short time together. And then we're going to wrap up at the end with temperament. And what do we mean by temperament? A father's temperament, a child's temperament, and how they can be really in sync, or sometimes when they're different, how we can help dads and even moms understand the role that temperament plays in child development. And along the way, you're going to grab some strategies for ways that you can help adults. If you don't work directly with fathers, if you're working directly with mothers or anyone who's supporting a dad or a father, to develop some healthy ways of being a parent. And then there's importance of knowing that role that temperament plays. So earlier I asked you all to think about like things that come up for you and to write them down, but go ahead and take a screenshot of this picture if you want. Because I want you to think about those thinking stems on the side. So as we're going through, for some of us who need that prompt, and Dara probably will put them in the chat, just answer these questions as we're moving forward. I'm thinking about program. I'm wondering how fathers can. I'm noticing policies it reminds me of. I'm figuring out, I just learned, and I am considering. Use those as, you know, what we call thinking stems, or the fancy literature, they call them metacognition, ways of us doing something with the information. And neuroscience says that when we learn something new or hear something new, we have 72 hours. That means we have 3 days to do something with it. Or our brains say, you don't need this information. And it immediately tells us to stop doing anything with it and definitely to not remember it. So one of the ways that we can hold it in mind is using those thinking stems and answering them throughout our short time together today. Thank you, Dara. It's so good to have help. I always feel special when Dara's there, because I know Dara and Leah at First Five, they move real quick. Sometimes I'm talking and it's already in the chat. I'm thinking, wow. So this notion of seeing fathers in this light of being involved to engaged is something I want you to hold in mind as a core piece of their role in child development and their role around how others see them. And this is beyond having, you know, gatherings where we share food and we laugh, but that they're core parts of systems, particularly systems that affect their lives and their child or their children's lives. That means if you work around fathers in some kind of way, or in some way where you're talking about them, but they're not at the table, we need to rethink, how do they become part of the system? And that work here that Kevin and Suzanne were talking about, that's a way that we're affecting those historical and systemic ways that fathers have been discussed, but not been at those tables where they're kind of on the menu, if you will. And as you begin to do that and move towards engagement, I offer up the Father Corp principles. You know, you can go to their site and think about, how are we engaging those fathers that we're talking about or thinking about. So I have 2 guiding questions for you that I want you to think about. So Dara, this is going to be our first breakout room. Only about 6 minutes. Only about 6 minutes. Put 3 to 4 people. 3 would be ideal, but if 4 has to go in, that's fine. So the first question is, how does offering father-friendly parent support and services contribute to fathers' understanding of their child development? There are no right or wrong answers here, but I want to hold that question in mind and discuss it in the breakout room. The other one, depending on who's in your room, you may or may not get to this one, or some people may want to start with this one. What about having male staff, or at a minimum, access to male providers who can work with fathers so that they understand their vital role and the vital role that they play in their child's optimal development? So we're just going to take 6 minutes, which means, you don't have to come back with a whole expansive answer, but the people who are in your room, in your breakout space, for those who are here when you go into that breakout space, let's discuss these two questions. So before they get pushed into the breakout space, Dara, if you will, please, I'm going to ask those with their cameras off in the breakout space, if that could be the time when you cut your camera on. Here's why. Because it becomes an issue of equity for someone with their camera on to go into a space and they're in this space with black rectangles and squares. So let's just try to have that human connection as much as possible, despite us being in this virtual space. And I know some of us are in workplaces where it's difficult, but if you can, I'm going to ask that you can in that breakout space. And when you come back to the large room, you can cut your camera back off. All right, Dara, 6 minutes. Welcome back.
I was having so much fun, but we had to come back to this big room.
Yeah, I know it's the sad part. Everyone's always right in the midst of conversation. So let's hear from a few people in rooms to kind of share with the large group your response to this question in the statement.
I could go.
Thank you.
My name is Oscar. I work at All of Us or None, which is primarily working on the civil rights and human rights of formerly incarcerated and currently incarcerated people. And the bigger challenge, I think, for us is that we serve. We don't do service provision, but we do work and have membership of people that are incarcerated and formerly incarcerated. And so the setting of having new children, oftentimes when people have done a lot of time, they do want to start a family because they missed a whole bunch of years, and so they want to start a family. So I think that there's a good setting for that. But I think that the biggest challenge would be around fathers that are incarcerated and maybe have children that are very young and they want to be part of it. And I know that I talked to one of my coworkers that did the best kind of parenting that he could while he was incarcerated. And but I didn't really understand the challenges that he faced. I think the mom was very helpful in facilitating that relationship, but I think that for the most part it's not that way. And so how do you surmount that challenge of maybe only speaking over the phone, and when they're very young, where they don't want to engage that way, it's going to be very difficult. Visiting is also a huge challenge. The burden of having to visit somebody very far and all that stuff. So I think there's severe challenges to a father that's incarcerated, and that's in prison and county is even worse, although the proximity of visiting is different, but the connection is not the same either. There's way more severe challenges. So that's something that I think about. And the other thing that we talked about was that the challenges of fathers seeing themselves in being in the role of the child's development, based on sexism in our society and how it functions. And I know that I, as a younger father, with my first two children versus now with my very young children, now I got a 5 and a 9-year-old, and I know that in me there's a bigger difference in terms of how I played a role in their childhood.
Thank you, Oscar. Definitely. I want to offer, if you said something that I think is really important, Oscar, because I think it happens in this kind of unconscious way, that fathers who aim to still be engaged and involved, even incarcerated, oftentimes what happens is the notion of parenting is the notion that I need to parent the way I would parent if I were not incarcerated. So everything is starting from this deficit place. And what we find is if that doesn't become the narrative, because that's an oppressive narrative that's constantly reminding them, you can't be all of these other things. So I think the starting place is not even juxtaposing it with, if I wasn't incarcerated, I could do all of these things, but to simply say, I'm incarcerated. These are the ways that I can parent. That is a strength-based approach. And too often we don't show up in that space. Even the people who are aiming to support that father or those dads, what they get is, if I wasn't here. So we're starting from this other place. So as much as we can start from the other place can be helpful to them. And I can't think of the name right now, and it's at a loss, but there's a program in California. They were actually on the news, that's why I know them, where they actually do exactly what you're talking about, Oscar. They connect children who are far from their parents, not just dads, but moms and dads who are incarcerated, and they're using tech to connect them. So instead of being on the phone, I would use something like FaceTime, or they had some other kind of, it was a prison-based system where they could see the parent, so younger children could see the person, smile, talk to them, so that visual piece of what the brain is asking for in terms of keeping connected. Then there was another program that actually puts families on a bus if they have to travel a distance. And both of these are in California, but I'm at a loss for the name right now, Oscar. I would need to talk to two of my good friends and colleagues who would know the names of those programs.
I know the second one for sure. And then the first one, just to point out, is that yes, now everyone has access to tablets, or most prisons have access to tablets now. And so, and they're free as well. Like you don't have to pay. And so that's been a burden lifted off families of having to take collect calls.
Yeah, thank you, Oscar. Another person want to share how your groom responded to these prompts?
I can go ahead and share a little bit. Kind of to build up on what Oscar said. When you have a kid, there's no manual, right? So as a mother, if you're not given a manual, much less as a father, right? So many fathers come into fatherhood not knowing what to do, not knowing what to expect. So simply offering those father-friendly services and giving knowledge about child development so that they know what they're going through with their child and have that support to, you know, deal with things like tantrums and stuff like that that are totally normal that other people might see as acting out and things like that. So just increasing that, you know, for all parents, but also for fathers, because it's increasing now, but in the past, fathers haven't been expected to be fully engaged in their kids' upbringing. So it's a good thing that that's changing, but we still need to support them with that change.
Definitely. Thank you, Jennifer. When you were talking, that thing that I ask everyone to do, it happened for me when Jennifer was speaking. It brought back my brother Demetrius. He was the first one of us to have a child. So my eldest nephew, when he had him, you know, I start saying, okay, we're gonna do this, we're gonna do that, and this. And I was naming all these things because child development is my area of expertise. And then I remember him telling me, you're stressing me out, you're making me anxious. He said, I just had a baby. I'm going to learn on the job. He said, I'm not aiming to do everything perfect, but he had enough resolve because he's my brother to say, I'm learning on the job and it's not going to be perfect. Yeah, you're going to be there to help, but just let me enjoy my baby. And that was over 20 years ago, but I still hold that in mind. And when you were talking, it brought me back to that experience, Jennifer, of do we actually offer and contribute, regardless of our role or responsibility, to fathers in particular, but also the mothers or the parents, this notion of you're learning and there's no expectation of being perfect. There's no expectation there's a right way to do it. And I think when we move away from that, it actually helps dads to step more into being an engaged father because they don't experience the judgment or here's the way to do it. Thank you, Jennifer. Maybe one more.
Okay, I'll share. In our group, we talked about the different role playing between the mother and father, because I just had experience yesterday. I was shopping and I saw this father walking with his kids, and all of a sudden he put the kids in the car and then started yelling at me, "Oh, you caused me this plus this." And I was it's kind of surprised, but I said that my input was that I think with the social media these days, and I think there's kind of less interaction and face connection when it comes to communication. Could that be a problem in communication in general? And I think we're all kind of cocooned in our world. So, but as for fathers and mothers, I don't know. We talked about how they were raised, what the mother did and what the father did. So it'd be interesting to hear what anybody has to say about this.
If I understood, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because I want to
Yeah.
make sure I understood the part around the communication
Mhm.
in technology. Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah.
So we do have emerging evidence that says, as a species, as a human species, our attention spans are diminishing.
Okay.
That if we watch a video that's only 4 minutes, the video registers internally as if it were 15 minutes. As not just teenagers, but adults, because technology is having this effect on us. So if parents and families, particularly fathers, can be aware of the fact that if they have a child or children who are using technology, meaning they always have this in their hand, it's forcing us to socialize differently. So then when we have to have that human connection, we're kind of showing up less than, because it's becoming this, and I'm not talking about it in a negative way, it's just what the evidence is telling us, that if we're aware of it, we have to do some things differently. So those things are, let's put our phones down and let's talk. And we know that the research keeps reconfirming that fathers who actually eat meals with their children, the simple act of saying, Sean, pass me the rolls, in us being at the table and eating together, we have this exchange of communication that is serving as a mediating effect for young children. So I often tell fathers, if you do nothing differently, but eat with your children as much as possible, it has a huge change effect on how they begin to socialize and their communication. And this is not even saying, tell your kid they can't use their phones. Or my good friend, Dr. Julia Shavrin, she at her house, when her children were teenagers, they would cut the Wi-Fi off for 2 hours to prevent them from being able to like socialize. They had to talk, but it was this forced talking within the house. But we do know if we sit down with children at meals, what we find is the communication increases and the exchanges of socializing increase also. Dara said no phones or technology at the table. But it might be Kevin calling me, Dara. I might need to answer it. Thank you all for sharing. Hold on to that. What you've heard.
Don, can I say a little something?
Of course you can, Kevin.
What we're seeing from those working with moms, particularly young moms, and their partners. So the folks who are working directly with moms, the feedback that they're getting is that their partners, the dads, don't really understand the role that they could play just to support mom with the new baby. Like they have had their parents, like their partners, tell them, this is your time. There's really no role for me. I'll come back when he can walk and can talk. You know what I mean? And so there's just this lack of information, which is why fathers groups are important, which is why having these types of trainings are important, so that we can go back and share that, no, you do have a role, even though your baby is brand new and breastfeeding. There are things you can do to bond and connect with your child, and your partner needs your support in doing that, because having a new child is really, really hard for a lot of reasons. And so that's what I continue to see with folks who are working with young mothers. A lot of times dads don't know what involvement looks like with a newborn or a very, very young child.
That's interesting you bring it up, Kevin. I jumped to this slide on purpose. And Kevin knows I've been saying, moms become gateways instead of gatekeepers. And that's a reorienting thinking that we ask mothers and grandmothers and aunties and sisters, females involved in that father's life to take on that, because so often the gatekeeping shows up. But we do know, Kevin, that based on what you just said, the evidence keeps telling us that a father's involvement at conception dictates his involvement after birth. Meaning, I'm not going to say it's too late, but it becomes a struggle sometimes if we want dad to be engaged after birth, if he wasn't engaged, during that pregnancy. So that's the time to catch him. Once they decide on, okay, we caused a pregnancy, we're going to move forward with this. Engagement starts right then.
Right.
Engagement starts right then. So
Right.
when mom's going to doctor's appointments and checkups, all of those things, we need to pull the dad in to become a crucial part of it. So our healthcare providers need to be welcoming to the emerging fathers becoming a part of those systems. And the moms have to not see it as this is me, but this is us. This is us. And that goes against your traditional structure of this notion of I'll come back when they're walking and talking, or I'll engage when they're walking and talking. Science actually says, if I'm not engaged when they're 1, I'm probably not going to be engaged when they're 4. But if it's the opposite, it's usually harder for them to disengage. If they've already engaged and started to build that muscle. So,
and I really appreciate you bringing up it's our job as providers to engage, right? I mean, we talk to dads all the time who go to these appointments, and there's one chair in the hospital room, or doc doesn't even look at them or ask him any questions about how they're doing and how they're feeling and what to expect and things like that. So yeah, that's a great point about it being our job to reach out and pull dad in, especially when he's there, because a lot of times they're there. They go to these prenatal visits in a lot of cases. So anyway.
Yeah,
Thanks, Sean.
That's a whole nother training, but
It's a whole nother training.
Well, what we're finding out about the age of the father and some evidence that is showing up, like we know that the older the father, the more aggressive the children become in preschool. Like in essence, old as men should not be having babies. Like that's really what the research is saying. Like you're 50 and 60 and you're trying to get with a 22-year-old and she's having a baby. We're seeing high levels of aggression in older men who father children. So there's some things we know that the healthcare providers could begin to talk about and say, hey, watch for these things as your child continues to grow, because we have to plant the seed sometime so that when parents hear it again, dads hear it again, moms hear it again, it's not the first time, but Kevin planted the seed. Then Noah said something, he's watering it. Then Dara says something, is getting more sunlight. And they're like, wait a minute, this isn't my first time hearing this. And that's just one example, but there's some concrete things that we're learning from the research around like dads and their age, dads and emotions, and how those are passed on to children. I think it's fascinating, but that's probably just Kevin knows I like to geek out sometimes on the science. So thank you, Kevin. So this notion of child development. So my area of expertise is really conception to age 8. And age 8 is those early childhood years. And it stops at age 8 because it's typically for most typically developing children, I didn't say all, it's at around age 8 that our moral development becomes solidified. It's usually around age 8, 7 for some children, 9 or 10 for others, that they fundamentally know they told a lie, that they fundamentally no longer believe that Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, is real. This pretend play is no longer something they want to engage in. So the brain takes a shift there, and we call that the end of the early childhood years, in the beginning of the adolescent years, when we're thinking of child development. So I'm not going to go deep into this because you can go to First 5 at any county, or Google ages and stages, and they're going to give you like all those markers and things to look for. And if you want more information on that, I highly, highly recommend that you go to First Five Alameda's Help Me Grow site on their website and get all of that information that just looks at ages and stages. And what should my 3-year-old be able to do as a 3-year-old? What should my 7-year-old be able to do? What should my 1-year-old be able to do, so that we understand those pieces? I'm going to jump us towards some things that fathers do differently than mothers in our short time together.
John, we got a question in the chat about what's the contributing factor that causes older fathers to be more aggressive. I think you were talking about children of older fathers are more aggressive, not necessarily the fathers, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct?
Right. Thank you for that correction, Kevin. It was the older father conceiving the child. Essentially, not the father being aggressive, but the older the father, they're seeing higher levels of aggression in the children that they bear.
Can you say anything about why that is? Do they have that research out yet, or are they just noticing that their kids are a little more aggressive?
Well, it's attached to testosterone and sperm. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I have a question. You mentioned their stages in let's say 3 years old, 5 years old, and what they should be able to do. Is there any information in there for children with special needs? I bring this up because my child is autistic and he's 5 years old. And I didn't know, obviously I knew because I have 4 children total. He's my
Okay.
youngest, that he wasn't going through the same stages as them. But I just think it's good information for people to have.
No, definitely. And that's the norms around what 3-year-olds should be able to do, or children on the spectrum. Usually we see it, we actually can see some things in infancy now. But we usually start to see it in toddlerhood, and we would look for certain behaviors that would say, uh-oh, this child has a lot of these indicators that could be possibly, this is the diagnosis. So what we want is for parents, fathers and mothers, grandmothers, abuelitas, tias, to say, oh, here's what 4-year-olds should generally be able to do. Wait a minute, my 4-year-old is doing like 2 of these 22 things. So let me go see what 3-year-olds supposed to do. Let me go see what 2-year-olds supposed to do, as a way to say, let me talk to a health professional and say, my child is kind of showing up a little bit less than what's over here, is usually the entry point. The other thing that most parents do, and you probably seen this, is they start comparing them to the other children. That's usually the indicator. When they're around other children, they're like, my kid's doing something completely different than the other children. And it's usually not playing with the other children. So looking for those pieces, I think, becomes easy for parents, mothers and fathers. I find that the gap happens in terms of they notice it, then they don't feel like they have anyone or anywhere to talk to about it. Or particularly, and we see this with high numbers of parents of color, they bring it to the pediatrician and they dismiss it. This happens all the time. They'll say, I'm concerned about my child so-and-so. The parent has caught it and the child isn't even 2 years old, and the pediatrician dismisses it. So I like to arm fathers and mothers with saying, don't go by yourself. It's always good to have somebody else there with you, because if they tell you no, the other person's hearing it differently, and they can say, well, wait a minute, can we talk about that some more? Or something that I do all the time, if I'm unhappy with the doctor and what they're telling me, I find another one. Like it sounds easy to do, but it's a little bit of work. So if you have that burgeoning concern about your child or children, and the response you receive isn't one that you think you should receive, keep digging.
And I had to do that. He just recently diagnosed a few months ago. And
Yeah.
because of COVID, I got a lot of pushback, but luckily he kept pushing and now I got the diagnosis. So
Yeah.
moving forward. Thank
Because
you.
the diagnosis helps him get targeted services.
Exactly.
And
So
we-
I could understand, give him a better life. His dad could understand. We are both trying to understand and help him live his best life, and us as well.
That's right. That's right. Kevin said we notice it and we don't want to admit the notice. Not my kid. Is hard to, right? Because there's a period of denial, guilt. Is this my fault? Is this something we did? All of those things could come up for parents. But if a parent see something and they're curious about it, I always say, run with it, run with it. So if we think about father-child bonding, move us forward. Thank you for that, though. I'm going to think about these things, these 3 questions. What are some of the things children do that frustrate or confuse their fathers? What do fathers want for their young children when their young children are in their mid-20s? And what can fathers do to support young children in those mid to 20s in terms of having goals and characteristics? So thank you, Dara. These 3 questions, you're going to go back into the breakout room. This is going to be our last breakout room. And then we're going to speed up a little bit when we come back. So what are the things that children do that frustrate their fathers or confuse their fathers? What do fathers want for the young children when those young children are in their mid-20s? And what can fathers do to support the young children to obtaining those mid-20 goals? All right, those are going to be the 3 questions that you'll take into your breakout spaces. So Dara, let's give them 8 minutes so that everybody can chime in for these 3 prompts, and then we'll hear from a few when we come back.
All right, opening the rooms now. Uh-oh, Selena's in there by herself.
It's hard to make that connection between what's useful and why you're doing what it is you're doing.
Yeah.
They don't do a good job of making the connection for you, is what helping folks understand why algebra is important, why pre-calculus is important. It's why critical thinking is important. Critical thinking exercises are important. It's teaching you how to use your brain.
Right.
No, you may never do pre-calculus again, but it teaches you how to problem solve, how to think, it teaches you a lot, and you don't understand that at
16.
17, 15.
It's interesting. Everybody's back now. So we're finishing up our conversation, everyone. Welcome back. I handled that a little bit differently with the teenagers who happen to be all boys, Kevin, in my life, around them not making the connections.
Mm-hmm.
What I go to is this notion of, imagine we all started something, and the only differentiation between all of us is some of us started and finished, and some of us started and stopped it. So instead of trying to tell them how algebra can help later, the conversation is always centered around what's going to distinguish is you started college and you finished.
Right.
You're telling the world I can complete things that I did, period. And that's the conversation. I don't try to make where they've already solidified this has no meaning in my 17-year-old life. So I'm not trying to pack them in, because I've been alive more than 50 years with them understanding my life and how it can show back up. I need to see it through that 17-year-old lens of you're telling the world that you can complete what you start. And that is a sign of successful human beings. All adults. That's the conversation right there.
Yep.
And then they stop the pushback. It's like, what do you start that you can complete? What friends do you know who started things that they didn't complete? You're like, how many of your friends were on the football team and they're no longer on the football team? How many of your friends were on the swimming team and they're no longer on the swimming team? Why aren't they on the swimming team or the football team anymore? And have this like 16 or 15-year-old response. But starting and finishing really is what the world wants from people.
That's a great point. Yes. Great way to frame it.
All right. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back. So Michael had a question in the chat that I didn't see that was brought to my attention. What age is considered older? So it actually depends on what you read. That's the real answer. It depends. Like the old research would say that 50 is middle-aged, but middle age really asserts that I would live to be 100. But the reality is most Black men in this country might make it to 70. So that means as someone who's in his 50s, middle age for me, if I make it to 70, would have been 35. But here they're talking about literally people who've lived at least half a century, and how their bodies are older, meaning what's being produced in their bodies. But this, I think it's kind of provocative because when you use the word older, it actually depends on what research you read and what angle they're coming from. But for this one in particular, they were basically looking at dads who were past 35 and dads in their 40s and 50s and even in their 60s who had parented young children. Thank you for the question, Mike. All right, so let's hear from a few people in our final hour together. How did you all answer the question number 1, number 2, number 3? No takers. Somebody who hadn't spoken last time. Let's bring some new voices to the Zoom space.
I can go.
Thank you.
Levon Gibson with Adult Protective Services here in the county, and for number 1, we kind of discussed a multitude of things. I mean, I have a 3-year-old son, and I have a newborn a new one coming in next week, actually, a new boy. And I know with my younger one, I guess he's older now. My interactions with him and trying to support my wife when you know, obviously she kind of needs a break from things, or he's kind of been with her all day, and I'm trying to get him dressed or get him some type of food, or you know, just kind of distract him for a while. But he really wants to just interact with my wife the whole time, and so it's a little frustrating and confusing. And at the same time, you want to give her a break and provide her some space, but you know, he's kind of he reacts better in certain situations or at certain times of the day when you know, he wants her to you know, change his diaper or put some pants on, or whatever that is, or, you know, whatever's going on. And you know, it's frustrating for me and a little confusing, like when you have some self-doubt and like, what am I doing something wrong, or you know, why does he not want to connect with me at this point in time? And then you kind of just realize, like, or maybe that, you know, that is because of the bond that they've had, or you know, he feels more comfortable doing that at this point in time. And other times it's not like that, of course, but you know, there are times when it is. So
Yeah, thank you for that. Can anyone talk about in your group what the fathers want their young children to have when they're in their mid-20s? And for those who aren't unmuting, I'm going to encourage you to start putting some of your conversation in the chat, because everyone can unmute. I think this would be a great way for these 3. What are the things children do that frustrate you or fathers? If we can start putting our responses in the chat. What do fathers want their young children to have when they're in their mid-20s? We're talking about like characteristics here. Thank you, Levon. Definitely, definitely.
I can go because I've got kids that are at that age.
All right.
And what I have wanted for them, I want them to be happy with themselves, comfortable in their own skin. I want them to be able to take care of themselves. I want them to be good people, good human beings. And I want them to have options and to do what it is that they want to do, which I think makes you happy. And so those are all the things that off the top of my head of what I want for them now, what I've wanted for them as a parent since they were young.
All right. Number 3, what can fathers do to support their young children in obtaining these mid-20 goals or characteristics? Can anyone get to question number 3?
Be present and supportive. That's some of the most important things that we discussed.
Okay, thank you, Selena. So here's this thing with these 3 questions. The order that they're in is actually not the order that they need to show up in our lives as adults. So it's almost a trick. So what actually happens is children do things, and I think Levon did a great job of saying, I'm a little bit not sure why my son does this to me, but not to her. And when we get to temperament at the end, that might be something that helps reveal some things for him around the temperament scale, or traits rather. So children show up in all of these kinds of ways. And then fathers have goals. Kevin articulated some goals. Priscilla put some stuff in the chat. It's like Christina put some stuff in the chat. We envision our children being older, on their own, no longer in our pockets, wanting our money, but making their own money, all of those things, right? But it actually starts with number 3. So question number 1 isn't the first question. Question number 3 is the first question, but it's the one we actually don't resource enough. So all those things that Kevin and Priscilla and that Dara will be talking about, our question for fathers is, what are we doing specifically right now so that they become those people in their 20s? That's the revolving question when we want to think about child development and our interactions and how we engage. What am I doing specifically that will build that human that I hope that they become later? Not leaving it to chance, but what am I specifically doing? So it's removing all the responsibility from the child and putting it on us as the adults to say, I'm going to do some things different. And it can be really, really simple. You know, I have what the world calls an education, but I still curse. I don't know why. Particularly if I'm real comfortable. It's not what I wanted to give to the children in my life. But guess what? One of them, I always hear him when they're playing those video games. He curses. And I have to solidify that he heard me curse a lot. He did. I'd be in the car, someone would cut me off, which is really a lot of times when it happens. And then if another adult says, he said this thing, and I kind of say, okay, but in my head, I'm not justifying it, but I know where it comes from. So if he grows up and uses it, I have to have a direct responsibility for it. If I was more conscious and in control of, I'm not going to do that, I'm probably 90% sure it wouldn't have started to happen. That's the change we want to see. So I just gave you a true story, but sometimes those can be really big things, really, really big things. So when we're thinking about our children in their 20s, it actually starts when they're 1, they're 2, and they're 3, around what are we modeling and demonstrating, not in our words, but with our actions around them. Joni says, also letting go a bit and allowing the child to exhibit the behaviors we want them to see. Just show up, listen, and refrain from problem solving. Interesting. You just reminded me of an article I just, I think I sent it to Dara. I just sent to a bunch of folk around gentle parenting. It was on The Conversation. And they were saying that all the parents who are taking this notion of gentle parenting that isn't new, but it's old and it's resurging, that a lot of them are stressed out. So the author was basically encouraging them all at the end, she basically was like, you just need to take a nap. Like, you're stressing yourself out trying to be a perfect parent, and there is no perfect parenting. But Joni's response reminds me a little bit about that, around how do we just let children be sometimes because it's needed and necessary. Thank you all for that.
Sean, what that also reminds me of last month when you talked about the different parenting styles, the problem solving for their children, and the opposite of letting them work through those on their own to build their own experiences and temperament through that.
That's right, Noah. So I'm not going to spend too much time on the next 3 because they're really just some child development stuff. And they're self-explanatory when you get the handout. We used to believe all the things on the left side, that it was the school entry door, the kindergarten school entry is when learning began. We actually know, we have the science that learning begins at conception, meaning when that sperm and that egg meet, learning begins. We actually know that when that sperm and that egg meet, everything, now here's the inequity of it, everything that woman, and some of it that man, but everything that woman, that female has taken into her body over the last 14 months shows up at conception. So I tell all my friends who smoke, if they want to have children, you've got to stop more than a year, because it's still going to be in your body a year later. It shows up at conception. I think that's amazing that we found that out, but we can't solve homelessness. But we're not going to get on that soapbox. I'm not going to go there. We used to believe, I either help my child get health services or education services. They actually go together. They actually go together. We have evidence that says oral health is the gateway to optimal health. And what I often do is I tell people, look at athletes. Other than MMA fighters who get their teeth kicked out, all athletes have really good oral health because the rest of their body is fit. So this notion of teaching children in Head Start how and when to brush their teeth is connected to education. It's not separate and distinct. And this notion of care and education. So if we think of the teachers who say, I teach children, I don't have to care about them. My question always back is, how do you do that? How do you teach someone that you don't care about? I think it's impossible. We used to believe that, you can come to our support services and receive services as a parent, or these services are for young children. We now know that the most thriving programs are generational, right? They're community-based and they're place-based. So I show up, but I can do my WIC appointment. I can maybe in that same, I'm thinking of the mall in Oakland, go grocery shopping, take my child to the Head Start site that's there, and go to the doctor all in one place, which is helping people to center their lives differently. And these are all the parts that we know that actually help parents of young children thrive when we think of child development. So we used to believe that there were planes that, you went through infancy, you went through childhood, you went through adolescence, and then you got to what we call like this place of maturity. But we actually know that child development is actually a spiral, is interconnected. And that spiral deals with the cultural, the chronological, and the individual. So chronologically, I might be a 4-year-old, meaning I was born this year. Culturally, there are some things that I might be in an environment that pushes me to become independent, but my family may be pushing me to become interdependent, that we do things together. And then I'm still striving to be an individual in the midst of my interdependent family and my independent kind of socializing experience. Dads and moms understand this differently, and you're going to find out what they do differently in a little bit later. And I'm not going to read these to you. This is just some of the research over the last decade and a half that just confirms some core things about fathers that we did not know before. Here's my favorite one. That the best cure, the best way the father can understand child development is to offer their child time and attention. Time and attention is the best cure because it builds their relationship. And it doesn't cost any money. It doesn't cost any money. Time and attention. And then that was confirmed by some research that really confirmed and reconfirmed that the quality of interactions is what supersedes the quantity of time spent together. Meaning, let's say one dad lives with his children, sees them every day, but they don't interact a lot. He's kind of what we sometimes call that present but absent parent. I'm physically there, but emotionally I might be distant, or I pay the bills and things, but I don't do anything really with my children. Compared to a dad that may only see his children 3 days out of the 7-day week. But in those 3 days, if the interactions are really, really high, it actually has been found to supersede fathers who actually live with their children 7 days out of the week, who aren't co-parenting in that way. The quality of interaction is what we need to understand about child development.
Sean, can I add my niece actually just shared that she's 20 now, 21, she's 22. But my brother and her mom broke up when they were young children, like 1 or 2 years old. And we were having this conversation about healthy relationships because they're finally at a point to where they get along now. The mom and my brother get along, friends and whatnot. But she was sharing how she remembers more of the time that she spent with her dad, and he was a weekend dad, because it was a thing. living with mom was just the regular day. Not that there was anything wrong that they didn't do things, but it was like an event to go and hang with dad for 2 days. And that is actually what they remember, because they did, they had high quality interactions. And not to say that she didn't have that with her mom, but because it was limited, it's what she remembers now as a 20-year-old, which caused a little resentment. Not now, but back in the day, it caused a little resentment. And I could, that makes sense, but it just verifies a real life example of
The quality of interactions
having a lasting impression.
on our brain, in our brain.
Yeah.
Which is what this slide gets at. It's just, again, research that talks about what children gain in terms of neuroscience around their dads. And again, I won't read this one to you. It's all there, and it'll be in the handout. I want to spend a minute with this one, expanding the roles of fathers. On the left side, you all know I like charts because our brains like order. We have some kind of traditional, or what we call historical roles of fathers. But then I want us to pay attention to the right side that looks at the emerging roles of fathers. So many of us might show up with this historical frame or ways of knowing and being in mind, but we've got to understand that fathers and dads are emerging differently from what's on the right side. I like the one at the bottom, that fathers are showing up with this notion of, I prefer to be a nurturer than simply I'm the provider, the present but absent dad. Dads are really working at being close and connected and attuned to their children instead of distant with their children. So they're working around the disruption that is historically with the other parent, right? So this has an effect on child development. We look at number 2. Dads are wanting to know more effective ways to be with and around their children, opposed to shut up and do what I say, or because I said it. Now, last month, this next slide, I ended up pushing it on the screen because we had this conversation, but this month, Noah, I specifically put it in here. And this one really this was census data from 1880 to 2009. I really want to update this data. I'm always waiting for the new data to come out. But that green line on the bottom is father-only homes. Look what happens from 1880 to 2009. Not much difference. The red line is no parents, right? Those are children who are living with relatives from 1880 to 2009. Wow, not much change. The purple line is mom-only homes. Look what happens at the end of the 50s. There's an uptick. There's an uptick of mother-only homes and children not living with mothers. There's a reason for that. There's a reason for that. So part of this notion of moms being gatekeepers is attached to this historical and real knowledge. Sean didn't make this up. Our system told mothers, if you say you are going to parent alone and there is no father, we will help you financially. We know you're poor. We will give you something that we created called welfare. We will give you access to food, but there can't be a man involved, even if it's your husband and he's the father of your children. So part of this notion was our system of government coming in and telling mothers who wanted to feed their children and fathers who wanted to feed their children that this was the way to feed your children. Sit with that for a moment. Noah, you look like you're bursting at the seams. You want to say something?
It takes me back to last month's conversation. Again, my experience in schools. Kids are at school. Kids can be at school for nearly 12 hours a day. They get there, they get breakfast, or they get before school programming. Then they get a snack. Then they get lunch. Then when they go after school, they get another snack. Some programs offer supper, and then they get picked up at 6:30. And then you had brought up a great point with the ECE. They can get dropped off as early as 6 in some programs and get picked up at 6. So just the time outside of the home alone was really shifted too.
Right. Thank you, Noah. But this chart, it says so many things. But the other thing here is, how do I show up as a father in terms of child development when I've been told I can't be involved, I can't be engaged, I can't be physically present? So hold that in mind as we consider, and when we think about fathers aren't involved in their child's development because they don't want to be. I want us to reframe that narrative and think about where it came from and how it still persists today.
Sean, in addition to that, this whole concept, what it did was not only push dad out of the house, but even when dad was there, he hid. We coached kids on not talking about dad being around, whether it's at school or other places. Dad stopped signing birth certificates because they didn't, for some of these reasons. Dads are left off of, intentionally, we leave dads off of school paperwork so that we can receive that subsidized spot. And then what happens is dad has kind of been in these shadows, and then the relationship doesn't work out. And so what it makes it easy to do is to act like dad has never been there.
Right.
So now I'm showing up to family court. I'm not on any of the paperwork. I'm not on any of his healthcare paperwork, the kid's healthcare paperwork. And now I have to prove that I've been there, and that's hard to do. So there are a lot of this whole pushing dad out. It has ripple effects in a lot of areas, which is a lot of the reason the Father's Corps exists.
Right. And in some states, Kevin, the rules change from state to state. In some states, you can be married and still one of those parents can go and file for custody of the child in the marriage. Meaning we're married, we live in the same house, but if I go pay the fee and file the paperwork, meaning if we divorce in 2 months, 2 years, or 20 years, this child legally is mine, not yours, according to the paperwork. Isn't that weird?
It's very weird. And I think that's another step in our work, Sean, is really trying to change this whole adversarial relationship that exists among parents for a lot of these reasons that we're talking about now. It was baked into the system.
Right. It is baked into the system. I just gave you the real life. My sister was a social worker for the city of Philadelphia, was married to her son's father. She had an untimely death. But literally, soon as they had the baby, she filed the paperwork. They were living in the same house, married. But because of the nature of her work, she was always thinking, if this doesn't work,
let me protect myself.
I'm not fighting for him later.
Right.
Paperwork says he's both of ours, but it says he's going with me.
Right.
I thought that was so weird.
It is very weird is a very nice way to put it.
But the system sets it up. So this notion of gatekeepers and gateways is part of our responsibility as social service providers and people who even maybe supporting mothers, specifically, to help them understand the places where gatekeeping is taking place, and they can open that gate so that dads can, while they may be attempting to repair the ruptures in their relationship from adult to adult, that the gatekeeping should not prevent them on developing healthy relationships with their child or children.
Exactly.
They're separate and distinct. So we ask moms and aunties and tias and abuelitas and grandmoms to become gateways instead of historical gatekeepers. And the research says that many young fathers, his number one support system is his mother. So the more that his mother can become a gateway instead of a gatekeeper, the mothers are actually becoming the gateways to what? That co-parent.
Right. Right. And just debunking this whole myth of, if dad was not a good partner, he may not have been a good partner. That doesn't mean he's not a good parent and doesn't deserve to have a relationship with his kids. And I think this whole narrative that dad wasn't good to me as a partner should restrict him, gives me the right to restrict him from having a relationship with his kids, is something that we work towards demystifying.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. These next kind of 5 slides, I think 6 slides, I'm just going to go through some confirming research regarding fathers specifically. So Kalberg and Guzman looked at Latino fathers in terms of the promoting well-being and how Latino fathers wanted to show up with their children. Some of the research considered, a lot of Latino fathers said they worked in the evening or at night and they wanted to play with their children. And they would actually wake their children up so that the children could see them while they were there instead of constantly missing them because they wanted to provide for their children this notion of well-being. But in doing so, they were missing it. So they would actually wake their children up sometimes 10 o'clock at night to spend an hour with them around the well-being that they wanted. In New York City, they looked at fathers who they offered them a training and the fathers declined it. And then when they changed the language around school readiness, 85% of the fathers showed up around languaging. So we need to pay attention to what language are we using to engage fathers, because it could be forcing them to disengage. And then when we consider home visiting, we saw an effective increase around Asian fathers in terms of home visiting. We see that with millennial dads, they really wanted to be involved in all aspects of parenting. So as Kevin said earlier, they wanted to go to the prenatal visits. They wanted to be involved in every single aspect of parenting that we oftentimes didn't see in the past. So we've got to help our healthcare providers understand that dads have a need and a desire, but does their healthcare facility, does their social service facility provide a space for them to feel welcomed and that they belong, right? Sanchez's research looked at African-American fathers who really centered on being nurturers, that they wanted to show up as nurturers who were involved in their child and children's lives. And my favorite one, Kev, is this notion of social networks when we look at Burt's research, that many young fathers, specifically fathers of color, said that what I need and don't always have is a connection to other fathers in my social network, people who are experiencing what I'm experiencing and understand it and want to do it with me, opposed to me showing up and being the only father, the only dad. So they felt like they thrived as fathers when they were able to connect with other fathers who had young children or children their age. So we're gonna take a look at a little video here. So when you listen to this video, I want you to think about what are the differences you hear between fathers in terms of child development. And this specific here is book reading and the pieces that show up around what mothers expect. This is really the differences on expectation, and oftentimes the father's expectation is seen as less than the mother's. Let's listen. Okay, we'll listen whenever that, there it is. I was waiting for that little MacBook spiral of death to stop spinning.
Bedtime stories from dad apparently give kids an early start.
They're lost.
A new study suggests that dads who read to their children at age 3 have a major impact on their child's language development a year later.
Usually I read to him every day, lots of times before bed, during the day, more at his schedule than mine.
Josh has a 3-year-old son named Caleb. He reads to Caleb in both English and sometimes in Korean. According to the study, moms have a different impact on child development when reading to them. She said moms focus more on detail and ask children to count objects or identify colors. Dads, on the other hand, tend to use more abstract language and link the stories to the child's own experiences.
My relationship with my son is much more hands-on, much more, I don't know, crazy and adventurous maybe than with mom.
Although Josh's reading may be a little more colorful than his wife's, the most remarkable change is in Caleb's newfound way of communicating.
definitely the last 3-4 months, he sort of exploded in vocabulary and his ability to talk and making sentences instead of just saying one word.
Dr. Theodosia Lovick suggests moms and dads should read to their children.
It increases their language, it increases their cognitive development, it increases, their creative abilities.
When reading, parents don't only strengthen a child's literacy rates, but according to Dr. Lovick, they form a bond with their child.
At the same time, it's teaching them things that we don't actually sometimes realize they're learning.
Donovan Long, Fox 31 News.
So in that short clip, what did you hear around if you juxtapose dads and moms in terms of the book reading experience under the umbrella of child development? What are some of the distinctions you heard, if any?
How they said dad will interpret the story differently or for the child and make it connected to their own experiences, the child's experience.
Okay, thank you, Noah. Anyone else?
Piggybacking on what Noah just said, seemed like dads tap more into the imagination and moms are more formal, what's written in the book.
Mm-hmm.
Sean, I would like to share something. My personal experience with my 8-year-old is when I read books, I read in different voices, make sounds, and to make it fun. She only likes to read picture books and comics, not regular textbook. We had difficulty figuring out why is not she interested in reading, and I figured out she loves comics, and we started reading. And I mostly used to read to her, and I started asking my husband to chime in, and we started doing. She didn't like him reading because he wouldn't make sounds, funny sounds. He would not interpret the pictures for her like I did. And then he started doing that, and he started automatically talking about her friends while he was talking about the situation in the book. And that's how you always end up talking about my friends. I don't like that. To now, you remember my friend did that. Remember, Baba? This is what she did. And that was the difference in her reading. Now her vocabulary has grown so much once he started chiming in, reading books, and then it's like, you don't make sounds, but we can make a picture out of it. Do you know, Baba? We can make picture out of it. And that enthusiasm in her developed. So I could relate to this video because I always focus on what is your concentration? Were you listening when I was saying it? What were you doing? And I asked her to reiterate if she was focusing, and he does that with friends. Like, remember your friends would use this word and you weren't, you asked me the meaning. Now here it is. This is what it means. That connection was really necessary for her to really understand what we were reading. And we read very differently to her. I could relate to this.
Awesome. Thank you for that. That's perfect. Because that's at the heart of this video is why I like it. Because it's not saying one is wrong and one is right. It's really spotlighting that they both are resourcing the child in different ways. So fundamentally, what we actually find in early childhood is that most mothers read books the way teachers read books. So we're reading the book to the child about the apples. Most moms turn to that page and say, how many apples are in that basket? There's 7. What color are those apples? That's red. They want concrete information the same way teachers want concrete information. Dads tend to read, they found, differently. Dad will say, oh, apples. I wonder if they're crunchy or sweet. Let's go to the kitchen and see if we have apples and see if they're crunchy or sweet. So both needed and necessary, but very, very different. Moms want you to get those words on the page. Well, dad will say, what's happening in the picture? Tell me what's happening in the picture. If a kid says, I can't read, I don't know what words are. And then the dad will say, sometimes moms do it too. But we see this kind of interaction of what's happening in the picture. Oh, you see the little boy, he's going up the hill and there's, he's pushing a bike. All right, you just read to me what's happening because you told me the picture. So there's this kind of almost sensory-based way of reading and using their bodies also. that we oftentimes see dads reading with children. So when we go back to that gateway and gatekeeper, what we don't want is for moms and abuelitas and tias and nans to say, stop, don't do that. You know, you got to read the book this way, but to understand they're both beneficial and necessary to child development. So, question for reflection: what can fathers do to support their child's healthy development? A lot of things. So we're going to hone in our last 15 minutes together on this notion of temperament and how can fathers and dads come to know their temperament. So some people confuse temperament with personality. They're really different. Our temperaments are innate. They're biological. Our temperament actually stays the same for the most part throughout our lifespan. It just increases across the continuum. In short, most adults build capacities to deal with their temperament. Most people never believed me. When Kevin first heard me say this years ago, he was looking at me like I'm calling BS. I actually am shy. I actually am a shy individual. Noah's like, I don't believe it. Noah's never heard me say this. I had two very, very non-shy parents who disliked that they had a shy son. Over the years, what I did was I built up my toolbox to work against. If I walk into a room and I'm not the presenter, I have to give myself self-talk. I say, show and smile. Don't sit at that back table by yourself and put your head down. Walk to the front. I literally, and I'm middle-aged, have to tell myself to do that. If I don't, I sit at the back table, I open up my phone, and I start playing on my phone and never look up. As a participant in my own learning, I know that it's my temperament, so I have to work through it. That's what I mean by that innate biological piece is still there, that I'm shy and I'm slow to warm. I am. Now, when I have to work, I'm forced to show up differently, and I've built my capacities over the years, but that's what we mean by temperament being biological, okay? Which is different than personality. Our personalities can shift and pivot based on the environment, based on who we're with, and they don't necessarily have to stay the same always. We know that this notion of temperament can be helpful for dads and children, for dads to understand their temperament, their child's temperament, what works together, when there are challenges, when they mesh well. So I'm thinking of my 3 god kids right now, because you all saw the picture of them. So when Buhau was born, he was born and I do this work, and I kept thinking, I'm like his legal godfather. If his parents perish, I have to take care of him. And I would joke with them, and I would say he might have to go to DHS. I'm not sure I'm gonna keep him, because our temperaments were so different. He came into the world like an 80-year-old man, and it bothered me so much. His sister showed up because her temperament was more in line with mine. I engaged with her completely differently. And he was almost 5 when I realized what it was. It never even clicked. I came to their house one day, and the door was open, but the screen was locked. So she was little too, and she was trying to open the door, but she couldn't reach it. And I kept telling her, get down. She was standing on the little stool that they sit on to put their shoes on, and the stool kept rocking, and I kept thinking she was gonna fall. He came to the door, crossed his arms, and looked up at me and said, what do you want? Now, in my head, I was thinking, I'm gonna spank you. That never happened. But that's what I was thinking. I gave y'all the nice version of what I was thinking. But I realized in that moment, like, he literally said, what do I want? And I started calling for Jonathan and Tiffany to let me in, because he could open the door. Had he turned the knob, I would have gotten in. But it was in that moment I realized I responded to both of them completely differently, and I didn't know why. And I realized later it's because his temperament wasn't in line with mine. He picked up on it, and it was my responsibility, not his, to do something different. So when we think of dads and their young children, and sometimes when dads are like, I don't know what's going on here, or I hear this a lot from the young cousins in my life who have young children. I actually had my cousin and her husband and their 3 kids live with me last year for 8 months. And Nick, their baby, he would always say, I don't think she likes me. I don't think she likes me. That's what he was literally saying about his infant daughter, because if he held her, she would sometimes cry, compared to Leah holding her and she wouldn't cry, or if I held her. And it was really him building his what? Wherewithal around, I can't hold her at 5 months the way I was holding her at 1 month. I can't hold her at 5 months, at 7 months the way I held her at 4 months. That some of that had to shift and pivot, that she was no longer a 1-month-old infant, that he had to show up a little bit different. And that was the hard part for him. So I'm putting in the chat box now, and this will be in the handouts that go to everybody, because I know if anyone's on their phone, you won't be able to download it. But it's just a double-sided parent temperament traits that really looks at all the temperament traits that we want parents, more specifically dads, to understand and look at around themselves and their child or children. So this is actually part of a much larger piece, but I'm only giving you this part of the handout. When you all get the resource, you can actually go, there's a book that tells you, if my temperament is this and my child is this, here's some things we can do. But I just shared this part right now for you to see. Here are the 9 kind of what we call them dimensions or traits that you would go through after reading the definitions on page 2, where it kind of defines for you what that might look like. Come back and think of that child. If it's your child, or maybe it's your niece or nephew, or it's a child you're engaged in some other kind of way, and assess yourself and assess that child and see if this helps you. And you can definitely share this with parents. There's an online version, and I'll be sending all those resources to Verve and Kevin so they can give them to you all. That if you don't want to print it out, you can go click the buttons. It's at Georgetown, and it's free and it's accessible online. If you want to print the PDF, you can print the PDF also. The limitation that I think confuses people is it'll say, one says infant and one says toddler, and it should really not limit it to that. But in child development, we often talk about temperaments for young children under 3. And I think we do a huge disservice to professionals and parents and families by not continuing to talk about temperament when children are past 3, because it still shows up, it's still relevant, and it's still necessary. But this is what's there for you to get a sense of how dads are showing up in terms of their temperaments, how can they define it, and then how their child might show up. So Levon did this, he talked about his child earlier, so he might want to do this for himself and his 3-year-old son to see, oh, we're similar here, we're different here. The other thing I find out about this scale is sometimes it can work both ways. The child that you're thinking of, you all may show up completely different on this scale, and it makes sense. And then it feels like the relationship is like this. And then sometimes you and the child show up completely the same, and the relationship is like this, right? So pay attention to that around, oh, these are our temperaments. Sometimes the child with a similar temperament is like this, Shola and myself. Sometimes the child with a similar temperament, it's actually more like this, meaning it requires more work. It doesn't mean it's friction and it's hard. It means the work on our parts as fathers, as uncles, as grandfathers, as adults, means we've got to lean in differently regarding how we understand temperament. And I feel like this is the best route for you to really experience your temperament, to develop some knowledge around it, and to experiment with this, opposed to just going through and watching videos and hearing about it. Everybody that tells me that they actually took it said, I learned something about myself, and I learned something about child or children. So we actually take these temperaments. Ron Lally, who's now an ancestor, he used to work at West Ed. He years ago kind of took those temperament traits and broke them down into 3 kind of areas. And anybody that's a quick math whiz would say, Sean, those numbers don't add up to 100. Of course they don't. And I'll talk about that in a moment. So we take those 9 traits and he broke them down into 3 smaller kind of styles, that some children are flexible and easy, right? That was definitely Madison. Some children are difficult or feisty, Shola. And some children are slow to warm or fearful. That's Buhai. So these 3 styles are all 3 of my godchildren. It doesn't add up to 100 because guess what? It's not a perfect fit for everybody. When I was younger, I was definitely more slow to warm. I'm still more slow to warm, and I gave you all my strategy. But I actually can show up sometimes really difficult and feisty. Kevin's experienced it sometimes. But I can actually still show up, I think now in middle age, more easy and flexible. But behind it, I always tell people, behind what appears to be easy is this slow to warm and fearful Sean, who's always still working to show up differently in the world, because my temperament style is really the one at the bottom, but I've worked on it so that I can show up a little bit more flexible in the world as an actualized adult. So think about that child that you're thinking about. And if you want to group them down into one of these 3, where is that child without having a lot of knowledge? And if you think about yourself, where are you? And again, it's not 100% because some people fall into more than one category. Okay. Other people say, nope, this is me. This one is it. I'm these 3, kind of pull me together nicely into this one style. But the hope and the goal is when we think about child development and we think of fathers, as they begin to explore the temperament traits, they're learning about themselves and they're learning about their child or children, and then they're acting on it to do what? To do some things differently. That's the goal. That I've learned this fundamental piece that can aid me in child development, and now I can show up differently. Oscar said, you confused me because I'm all 3. And that's why it's not 100, Oscar. Nope, don't be confused. Remember, I said there are ways that I can still show up as all 3, but my core anchor is I'm slow because I'm fearful, right? That's my core. But I've developed core capacities so I can show up in those other areas. What we usually find is when you go through the 9, you'll probably say, oh, these 2 are really, really, really me, but these ones are me also. But then other people will say, nope, I'm not this, I'm not this, I'm not this. This is how I show up in the world. So it's not about, wait a minute, I'm all of them, so I'm confused. That's why it's not 100%, because some of us show up in multiple areas that in those ways. That's a part of it. I think that's the part of the beauty of it, so that we're not boxing people in, because it's not about boxing you in, but saying, how am I showing up as a dad? And is this congruent to how my child has been born into the world? And how can I be more helpful by understanding the ways that they navigate space, which may be similar to me or may be very dissimilar to me, and then we do something about it. So in the book, Oscar, I didn't put it in the attachment just because it's a large PDF, but the PDF that comes along with it, I can open it up for you, Oscar. It actually, I'm gonna put it on the screen. Here's how it can make a little bit more sense. Where is, in our few minutes that we have left together.
John, while you're looking for that, I'm just going to ask folks to complete the survey we put in the chat. Please take time to complete the survey for today's training.
So I gave you this slide right here, this one, this page, and in this page. Those are the pages I gave you, but the document is really about 12 pages long. So after you do it, you kind of assess yourself by reading the core definitions and saying, okay, I get what they are. And then saying, am I high active, less active? Am I easily distracted, less distracted? Do I have an intense personality? I have a relaxed personality. You know, am I more spontaneous? Am I highly sensitive, less sensitive? So you're bubbling in saying, I am those things, or if you're not, you're just saying I'm the other. And then you're thinking about that child. Then here, once you kind of figure out, oh, wait a minute, I'm pretty much these. If you're thinking of activity level, it tells you if I have a high activity level and the child has a high activity level, here's some things we can do. If I have a high activity level, but this toddler has a less activity level, this would have been me and Buhai. Here's some things we can do. So it just takes you through each one of the temperament styles and gives you some concrete things to do with that child. That's the acting on once we kind of realize, ooh, this is my temperament. What can I do about it? Those are some of the things we can do about it. And temperament is so connected to child development that for fathers who are wanting to engage and engage differently, I feel like it's that piece that has to go in there, because we were just talking yesterday with the First 5 training that when parents, millennial parents are saying, I don't want to parent the way I was parented, but then here's the issue. They don't do the things that was modeled for them, but they replace it with nothing. We've got to replace it with something. Or what ends up happening is poor parenting styles or interactions begin to happen. But we can use temperament to guide us towards more effective parenting interactions with our child or children. All right, Noah, we got like 3 minutes. Any questions before we finish up? Thank you all for staying. I know it's been a lot presented at you. Definitely the survey. Well, wait a minute. Let me go back to Oscar. You still confused, Oscar? Talk to me. Okay, he gave us a no. Awesome.
No, I'm not confused. I said it a little bit as a joke, but I think that where I kind of question it is based on, like, I think that I'm assertive at times, but I don't know why. I just am. Maybe I'm passionate about certain things, but I know that for the most part, and maybe that's what you're talking about with the core thing. For the most part, I'm kind of that laid back, kind of shy, and that kind of thing.
Okay, right. And when you go through it, when you go through the 9 types, talk to yourself about, am I really this, or is this how I? Here's the thing about when we self-assess ourselves with anything, and I should make a slide for this. We should be self-assessing on our trait or style based on our real actions, not on who we want to be. Because most times when we self-assess on, I show up that way, and then Noah looks at me and he says, I never see you do that, Sean. Because I've judged myself on my intentions, not my actions. So this is designed for you to really say, here is my evidence of this is how I've shown up in the world. So Sean would say, this is how I've showed up in the world for 50 plus years, which is why I know that I'm slow to task and kind of fearful or shy. It took me years to be able to say out loud to people that I was slow to task, because it feels like, I needed an IEP. And that's not really what it means. And my godson is officially, he got labeled slow to task. Our brains don't work the same way, but my slow to task was this fearful nature of, I'm walking into this new place. Let me just stay away from everything. As a child, that stayed with me as an adult. So the more we're answering those questions on lived experience, thank you, Michelle, then we're going to answer them correctly, and we'll pinpoint our temperament so that we can then understand our child's. That's the goal. I need to understand me and my temperament so that I can understand my child or my children's more effectively, and use temperament as not the end all be all, but use temperament as another path towards parenting effectively from a child development lens. Thank you all. Thank you for staying, for participating. I hope this has been, it's been recorded, so you'll be able to watch it again. Like I said, you'll get a copy of the slide deck in addition to the recording and the other handouts, and I'll send the other pieces to them so that they can share it with everybody from First 5 to make it easier on everyone. So thank you all. It's Friday. Doesn't feel like Friday, Kevin.
Yes, thank you all. Thank you all for